class, we're going to look at the topic of new social movements. Okay, you're going to get a lot more out of this screencast if you try and make some notes as we go through this particular topic. And there are three things that I think you should focus making notes on. Firstly, you obviously need a definition of a social movement. Secondly, during the course of this presentation, we're going to look at the impact of new technology on social movements, particularly Web 2.0 and wireless communication devices. And thirdly, we're going to look at some of the other underlying reasons for the emergence of new social movements. As we can see here, there was a 45-mark question specifically on new social movements in the January 2013 paper. Also, quite a lot of the stuff that I'm going to go through in this presentation would also be highly relevant to this type of exam question, focusing on the impact of new technologies on politics. So we obviously need to begin with a clear definition of what we mean by a social movement. So we can see here we're talking about a large group of people, a broad coalition of people who are distinguished by common aspirations. So that just means that they share in common certain goals, high-level political commitment, but often lacking clear organisation. And what this means is that social movements often lack the kind of formal organisational structure that we might associate with a political party or a pressure group. And I would argue that a feature of many contemporary social movements is that they don't want to become allied to a particular political party. If you take new social movements such as the Occupy movement, I think they have the radical aim of transforming the political system rather than reforming it. And therefore they don't want to be co-opted by any particular political party or organisation. Now we can trace the history of social movements back to the early 19th century when we begin to see the development of a coherent labour movement to provide representation for the newly emerging industrial working class in Britain. Then a little bit later on we've also got the development of a women's movement, the kind of first wave of feminism focusing on achieving political equality for women. But it's during the 1960s that we begin to see a real flowering of new social movements. We see a second wave of feminism focusing on other forms of gender inequality that go beyond politics. We see an anti-racism movement, like the civil rights movement in America. We see the emergence of a gay rights movement. So we've got a whole range of social movements that aren't simply about class, they're about other forms of political identity, as well as new issues beginning to emerge. The peace movement and also the green movement really begins to emerge during this period. Now, if we go back to the exam question that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, you'll see here at the end of the question, it says that the focus has got to be on contemporary society. So that means that we've got to focus on what's going on at the moment. We've got to have examples that are, really relevant and really up to date. And I think ever since the Arab Spring started in Tunisia in 2010, it's been a really interesting period for the study of new social movements. In fact, the sociologist Manuel Castells, in his recent book, Networks of Outrage and Hope, goes as far as arguing that we've now got a new type of social movement that's emerged that is very much a product of what he calls the unfolding information age. In his book, Manuel Castells conducts an empirical analysis firstly of the Arab Spring movements in Tunisia and Egypt. Then he looks at the Indignados movement that emerged in Spain in May 2011, before going on to look at the Occupy movement that first emerged in New York in the autumn of 2011. And in his book, Manuel Castells argues that there are certain structural features that all of these social movements seem to share in common. And these include the use of direct action, particularly the occupation of urban space, pioneered of course by the Egyptian occupation of Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring. Secondly, we're talking about social movements that have a very loosely defined organisational structure. So they usually lack clearly defined leadership, they reject the idea of hierarchy, they're what we call horizontal social movements that don't have a formal structure of formal leadership. Thirdly, there's complete opposition to conventional party politics. So these are social movements that see the existing political system as corrupt, and they've no desire to be co-opted by an established political party. And finally, we're talking about really radical social movements who don't just want to influence the state, they want to completely transform the values of society and the whole political system. So Manuel Castells argues that the ultimate aim of these new social movements is the goal of reconstructing democracy from the bottom up. And if we think about like the Occupy movement and the emphasis that it placed on participatory democracy, we've got an example of that idea. And perhaps the most important feature that makes these new social movements particularly distinctive is their use of new technologies. New technologies offer social movements the possibility of creating autonomous networks of communication, which means that they can bypass the government-controlled or corporate-controlled media. In his empirical study of the Egyptian and Tunisian Arab Spring, the Indignados movement, the Occupy movement, Castells sees a similar pattern common to each of these movements. The trigger every time, he argues, is anger. There's always a spark of indignation that gets these movements going. However, there's often another powerful emotion that stops people from taking to the streets, and that is, of course, fear. But Castells argues in each of these movements, when people were frightened, the fear was overcome by individuals sharing in the outrage together online. So you can see there from the quote from Castells, we're all trembling, but when we cannot hold hands in the street, we hold hands on the internet. So the new technology that we're talking about is, of course, Web 2.0, with this important idea of interactivity and user-generated content, which allows people to become producers of media content rather than just passive consumers. And the wireless communication devices, which means that being online all day is now the norm for many people, and the ease of access to these new technologies means that more of us are willing to post material and to help create content online. And this has been really significant politically, because these wireless devices, these smartphones that protesters have in their pockets, turn the protester into a citizen journalist. As the BBC journalist Paul Mason argues, in the crush of every crowd, so every time we see a large demonstration, we also see arms holding mobile phones in the air, like small flocks of ostriches, snapping scenes of repression or revolt, offering instant and indelible image capture to a global audience. And some of the images captured by the protesters on their smartphones, when they're disseminated via the internet, they are very, very powerful, and they feed back into the movement by encouraging perhaps more people to support the movement or to take action. In the past, many of these images would have been repressed, and a group's ability to communicate effectively was determined largely by its financial resources and access to the mainstream media. Now, the internet and wireless communications have made it far easier for social movements to identify and communicate with potential supporters, as well as broadcasting their message to the population as a whole. However, new social movements aren't simply the product of Facebook or Twitter. Whilst online activism can be effective, and is often where these social movements begin, recent major political change has also required boots on the ground. And for Manuel Castells, it is this intersection between urban space and cyberspace which is perhaps the most distinctive feature of new social movements. And of course, this idea of occupying urban space spread virally from the protests in Egypt to the Indignados movement in Spain to the Occupy movement that started in New York and then spread to many other cities, including London, later in the autumn of 2011. So in addition to focusing on technology as a facilitator of social movements, we also need to look at some of the deeper underlying causes of new social movements. And for many sociologists, this is largely down to the lack of trust that people have in formal political institutions, a situation that sociologists call a crisis of legitimation. And there is indeed lots and lots of evidence to support this idea that there is a complete lack of trust, a lack of faith in formal political institutions and organisations. So we can see here, if we look at membership of political parties in Britain, looking here at the Conservative Party, massive decline in membership, so down from about 3 million members at the beginning of the 1950s to probably about 200,000 members now, and a similar pattern with the Labour Party. So we can see here in the 1950s, Labour Party membership peaking at about 1 million, and then again going down to about 200,000 in the present day. And this crisis of legitimation is also reflected in overall levels of turnout, which we can see peaked at around about 85% at the beginning of the 1950s, but has fallen into steep decline in recent elections. And this collapse in trust and confidence in politicians and formal political organisations is not unique to Britain. So here we can see a very similar trend in the US. So what this shows is that by 2010, you've got more than half of the American population who either don't trust their politicians at all or don't trust them very much. And looking at the European Union, again, the same kind of pattern. So you've got less than half of the population trusting either the European Union or the national parliament or the national government in EU countries. And this lack of trust, this crisis of legitimation, seems to be particularly pronounced amongst the younger sections of the population. So, for example, Paul Mason, in his book Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, argues that if we look at recent social movements, at the heart of all of these new social movements is a new sociological type, and that is the young graduate with no future. And of course, it's no surprise that the emergence of new social movements like the Indignados movement and the Occupy movement has coincided with the financial crisis, which has had a significantly negative impact on the life chances and job opportunities of young people, including young graduates. So returning to our objectives, hopefully now you can define a social movement, you're aware of the impact of new technology on new social movements, and you can explain some of the other reasons for recent social movements. If you want to find out more about this topic, you can follow @ParkSociology on Twitter. You can look at the Podology website, where I've written an article on technology and new social movements, and you can also look at lectures by Manuel Castells on YouTube.